The Miami sun beat down, turning the water of the infinity pool into a blinding mirror that reflected the cloudless sky. I was at my son Daniel's mansion, a palace of glass and white marble in a suburb where money seemed to sprout from the ground. The air smelled of expensive sunscreen and champagne, mixed with the constant, pulsating sound of soulless electronic music. Around me, slender, tanned bodies moved with a confidence I had never known. They were Daniel's friends, people whose laughter sounded rehearsed and whose smiles didn't reach their eyes. I felt like a bird of another species, with gray, worn feathers amidst a flock of colorful, noisy peacocks, completely out of place and invisible in the opulence he was so proud to display to the world. My simple cotton dress, the best I had, looked like a rag next to the designer bikinis and linen shirts that surrounded me. My hands, calloused by 72 years of life and decades of work with a needle and thread, held a glass of water with a firmness I didn't feel inside. My shoulders were stooped, not just from age, but from the invisible weight of being a burden, a relic of a poor past my son tried so hard to erase. I watched the guests and realized that no one really saw me. To them, I was just part of the furniture, an old, out-of-place object that didn't match the modern, cold decor of that house. Loneliness was a chill that not even the Florida sun could warm. Then I saw him, my Daniel. At 45, he was the picture of success. The perfectly coiffed hair, the charismatic smile he used as a weapon to charm his business partners and influential friends. He gestured, told a story, and everyone around him laughed at the exact right moment. I felt a pang of old, bitter pride. That man was my son, the child I raised with so much sacrifice. But I didn't recognize him. His eyes, an icy blue, passed over me for an instant, unfocused, as if I were just some stranger who had crashed his party. That look was more painful than any cruel word he could say to me in private. The music pulsed in my ears, and for a moment, I closed my eyes and remembered another song, a lullaby I used to sing to him when he had a fever. I remembered the smell of his childhood hair, the way his little fingers clung to mine. The contrast between memory and reality was an open wound. There, at that loud, superficial party, the greatest poverty was not in my clothes or my worn hands, but in the emotional distance that separated us. He had built an empire of material wealth, but in the process, he had demolished the bridge that connected us, leaving only an abyss of silence and indifference between us. I decided I had to try, one more time. Maybe it was the foolish hope of a mother, a need to believe that somewhere inside that cold man, the boy I loved still existed. I wanted to tell him a fond story from his childhood, a moment when we were happy with so little, hoping it might spark a flicker of recognition in his eyes. With a heart tight with anxiety and trembling legs, I started walking towards him, feeling the disdainful glances of the other guests who sized me up before turning away with indifference. Each step was like walking towards a cliff. As I approached the group where he was the center of attention, the noise of conversation and laughter seemed to grow, creating an invisible barrier. Daniel had his back to me, holding a glass of champagne, his posture exuding power and arrogance. He was telling a joke, and the others laughed with a devotion that seemed forced, as if laughter was the price of admission to his exclusive circle. I waited for a pause, a small break in his performance, so I could speak to him, to have just 1 minute of his attention. That minute seemed worth a lifetime of waiting, and the vulnerability I felt at that moment was almost unbearable. Finally, I summoned my courage and touched his arm, a light, almost hesitant gesture. "Daniel, my son," my voice came out weaker than I intended, a fragile whisper amidst the cacophony of the party. He turned abruptly, and the smile on his face vanished the instant he saw me. His eyes narrowed in an expression of pure irritation, as if my mere presence were an intolerable offense. The change was so swift and brutal that it made me take a step back. The coldness in his gaze froze the words in my throat, and I knew I had made a terrible mistake by interrupting him. "What is it, Mother?" he asked, his voice, loud and laden with a contempt that made his friends fall silent, curious to see what would happen. Shame hit me like a wave of heat. I felt small, inadequate, a stain on his canvas of perfection. I tried to start the story, stammering about a day at the park, about a red balloon he had lost, but he cut me off before I could finish. Now is not the time for your old stories. Don't you see I'm busy with important people? He said, and each word was like a stone thrown at me, feeling the impact in my chest. And then, to complete the humiliation, he made the gesture that would change everything. With a cruel smile on his lips, he gave me a playful shove towards the edge of the pool. "Go cool off a bit, Mom. You seem tense," he said, and his friends laughed, complicit in his cruelty. The push wasn't hard, but it was enough to unbalance my aging body. For a second, I saw the terrified reflection of my own face in the crystal-clear blue water before the world turned and the surface broke, with the impact of my frail body. The icy water was a violent shock, stealing the air from my lungs and enveloping me in a terrifying, aquatic silence. The sound of the party disappeared, replaced by a muffled ringing in my ears. My dress felt as heavy as lead, pulling me down. I couldn't swim well, just enough not to drown in calm waters, but panic took over. My arms and legs thrashed wildly, fighting to find their way back to the air, to the light, to life. With every gulp of chlorinated water, the desperation grew. When I managed to surface for an instant, coughing and choking, my eyes instinctively searched for him. And I saw him. Daniel was standing at the edge of the pool, not with concern or fear, but with a sneer on his face. He was laughing, a loud, genuine laugh that echoed through the momentary silence of the party. "Don't be so dramatic, Mother," he shouted for all to hear. His wife and a few of the guests joined in his cruel laughter, turning my panic into an entertainment spectacle. In that moment, at the bottom of the pool, something much deeper than my body was drowning. It was the last drop of love and hope I still held for him. It was then that one of the waiters, a young man with a frightened face, jumped into the water without hesitation. He grabbed me and pulled me to the edge, the physical relief of being able to breathe contrasting with the emotional pain that tore me apart inside. I collapsed onto the marble floor, shivering and spitting. Out water, my soaked body the center of all eyes. But I didn't look at my savior. My eyes were fixed on Daniel. He was watching me with an expression of pure annoyance. His only concern was the scene I was causing, the stain my humiliation was leaving on his perfect party. The party noise slowly returned, but for me, everything was silent. A devastating silence, where the truth was revealed with cutting clarity. The son I loved, the boy I raised, no longer existed. In his place was a cruel stranger, a monster who took pleasure in my pain. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I stood up. Water dripped from my dress, forming a puddle at my feet. I ignored the whispers, the looks of pity and mockery. Without grabbing my purse, without saying a word, I began to walk. Each step left a trail of water on the marble floor, a trail that marked my path out of that house and out of that life. The decision was made in the silence of my broken heart. I would never go back. In that moment, between humiliation and despair, I chose myself. I chose my dignity over an illusion of family that only caused me pain. I kept walking, beyond the golden gates of that mansion, not knowing where I would go, but knowing, with absolute certainty, that I was walking towards my own liberation, leaving behind the woman who had allowed herself to be invisible for so long. My story of pain and rebirth is just beginning. If you want to know how an invisible woman found her voice, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments from what part of the world you are following me on this journey. The lights of the luxury cars passing me on the street were like distant stars from a galaxy I no longer belonged to. My soaked dress clung to my skin, and every step was a monumental effort. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the Miami sky in shades of orange and purple, an ironic beauty that contrasted brutally with the desolation in my soul. I was completely alone, a fugitive, with no destination in a neighborhood where the sidewalks were cleaner than my wounded dignity. The reality of my situation began to set in like a chill from the inside out. The rent for my small apartment, my food, everything depended on the sporadic help Daniel gave me, a pittance he used to maintain control over me. And now, I had absolutely nothing. My mind, in an act of self-defense, fled to the past. I remembered the smell of new fabric in the small workshop I kept in the back of our old house. I was young, strong, and my hands moved with the speed and precision of a dancer over the pieces of clothing. I raised Daniel alone, after his father decided that freedom was more important than family. I worked at 2 sewing shops during the day, and at night, I did alterations for the neighborhood. Every penny was saved for his education, so he could have the opportunities I never had. Every prick of the needle in my fingers was a small sacrifice in his name, a brick in the construction of the bright future I dreamed for him. He was a sweet boy, with curious eyes and a smile that lit up any room. I remember him sitting on the floor at my feet, playing with spools of colored thread, turning them into little soldiers. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. It happened in college when he met people from wealthy families and began to feel ashamed of our simplicity. First, it was criticism of the way I spoke, then of my clothes, which he called old-fashioned. The shame he felt for me became a barrier between us, a wall that grew until I could barely see the boy I had raised on the other side. Over time, as his bank account grew, the shame turned into cruelty. The criticisms became humiliations disguised as jokes in front of his wife and friends. He referred to my apartment, the home I loved so much, as a shoebox. My stories about the past, the same ones he loved to hear as a child, became depressing and embarrassing. He kept me around only as a trophy of his supposed kindness, the good son who took care of his elderly mother. But in the solitude of our rare moments alone, he constantly reminded me of my place, of the burden I represented to his impeccable image. The sound of an approaching bus pulled me from my painful memories. I was at a bus stop, without even realizing how I had gotten there. I rummaged through my small, wet purse and found a few coins, enough for a ticket. The destination didn't matter, as long as it was far away, to a place where the shadow of his mansion couldn't reach me. As I climbed the steps of the bus, I felt the curious stares of the other passengers on my wet clothes and tear-streaked face. I sat in the last seat, huddled against the window, feeling like a fleeing criminal, although my only crime had been loving the wrong person too much. The bus ride was like a transition between 2 worlds. The bright storefronts of designer shops and sophisticated restaurants of Miami Beach gave way to lower buildings, neighborhood laundromats, and small Latin markets. Every kilometer traveled was a small victory, a physical distance that I hoped could translate into an emotional one. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in my stomach, but mixed with it was a new and strange feeling, a spark of freedom. For the first time in many years, I didn't have to worry about pleasing Daniel, about measuring my words, or hiding my origins. I was just me, an elderly, soaked woman on a night bus. But freedom came with its dark sister, guilt, an insidious voice in my head, which sounded frighteningly like my own mother's, accused me. "What kind of mother abandons her son?" it whispered. "Your duty is to forgive, to endure." This guilt was a poison, cultivated by a lifetime of teachings that a mother's love should be unconditional, even in the face of abuse. I clutched the steering wheel of the seat in front of me, tears streaming silently down my face, fighting an internal battle between the instinct for self-preservation and the crushing weight of a devotion that had become toxic. My purse began to vibrate. It was my cell phone, which I kept in a small plastic bag to protect it from moisture. Daniel's name glowed on the screen. My heart leaped, a mix of panic and a foolish, residual hope that he might be calling to apologize. I knew it was a lie, but a part of me still wanted to believe. I could imagine his anger, not for my sake, but for the disruption my departure had caused at his perfect party. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about appearances, about the stain on his reputation as an exemplary family man. That name flashing on the screen was a reminder of his control. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Seconds later, he called again. And again. The insistence was aggressive. An order, not a request. Then, a text message arrived, lighting up the dark screen. The words were short, cold, and direct. "Where the hell are you? You're embarrassing me!" That sentence was the final nail in the coffin. No question about my well-being. No sign of remorse. Just the accusation, the selfish concern for his own image. With trembling fingers, I held down the power button until the screen went completely black. The silence that followed was the sound of my final liberation from that invisible leash. I got off the bus in a neighborhood I barely recognized, guided only by a vague memory. There was an old church on those streets, a place that, years ago, offered help to those in need. I found it, but its large wooden doors were locked. Despair threatened to swallow me. Next to it, however, a warm yellow light came from the windows of a smaller building, a community center. Hesitation paralyzed me for a moment. Asking for help was admitting my defeat, my total vulnerability. But the alternative was sleeping on the street. So I took a deep breath and pushed the door. The warmth and the smell of hot coffee embraced me as soon as I entered. Yantai tea. Place was simple, with old furniture and walls decorated with children's drawings, but the atmosphere was one of genuine welcome. A woman with gray hair and a kind smile, who introduced herself as Elena, came towards me. Her eyes didn't judge me. They saw my deplorable state, the water still dripping from my dress, the tremor in my hands, and instead of questions, she offered me a wool blanket and guided me to a chair. That simple gesture of humanity was more than I had received from my own son. In years, her kindness was the last straw that broke my emotional dam. Sitting in that chair, wrapped in the warm blanket, I began to cry. They weren't loud, desperate sobs, but silent, uninterrupted tears that washed away years of pent-up pain. Elena said nothing. She just sat next to me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder, offering the silent, supportive presence of someone who understands that sometimes the only thing you can do for someone is to witness their pain without judgment. In Steki, that small community center, a complete stranger made me feel safer and more welcomed than I ever felt in my son's luxurious mansion. Gradually, between tears and sips of coffee, I began to tell my story. The words came out stumbled, fragments of a life of sacrifice and of a recent, overwhelming pain. Elena listened with infinite patience, her face expressing the empathy of someone who has known suffering. She didn't offer me easy solutions or false promises. She just told me I could spend the sao night there, in a small room in the back that they kept for emergencies. The gratitude I felt was so intense, it left me speechless. That night, in a simple but safe bed, I slept for the first time in a long time, without the fear of what Daniel would do or say next. The next day, Daniel's war against me began. Using Elena's phone, I called my niece, the only relative with whom I still had some contact. Her voice was different, distant. She told me that Daniel had called the whole family, spreading the story that I was mentally unstable, suffering from senile dementia, and that I had had a psychotic break at his party. He was methodically destroying my credibility, painting me as a crazy old woman so that no one would believe my version of the facts. He wasn't just abandoning me, he was trying to erase me. The next weapon he used was money. When I went to an ATM to check my balance, expecting to find the small amount he deposited every month, my heart froze. The balance was only a few dollars. He had completely cut off my only source of income. It was a cruel and calculated strategy. He would leave me homeless and without food, believing that desperation would force me to come back, begging for his forgiveness. He wanted to break me, to humiliate me in a way that would leave me completely dependent on him, proving to himself and to the world that he was in control. The poison Daniel spread quickly contaminated my family. My niece's words on the phone confirmed my worst. Fear. "Auntie, Daniel is so worried about you," she said with false compassion in her voice. "Maybe you should go back home. Accept his help. He wants to put you in a very good nursing home." They had believed the facade of the devoted son. To the world, He was the successful businessman, the pillar of the community. My truth, the truth of a retired seamstress with no resources, stood no chance against the powerful narrative his money could buy. The final threat arrived a few days later, in an official envelope, an eviction notice. I had 30 days to pay the 3 months of back rent that Daniel had deliberately not paid, or I would be thrown out onto the street. The paper trembled in my hands. His plan was perfect in its perversity. He would take away my family, my money, and finally, the roof over my head. The fear was a physical presence, a cold claw squeezing my chest, suffocating me. For a moment, the idea of giving in, of calling him and submitting, seemed like the only way out. But I was no longer completely alone. When I showed the notice to Elena, I saw anger flash in her eyes. She and the other volunteers at the community center rallied around me. They couldn't pay my rent, but they offered me a safe place to stay during the day, shared their meals with me, and gave me something money can't buy: unconditional support. My sewing skills came to light when I fixed a broken coffee machine and mended some donated clothes. They saw a talent in me, not a burden. It was Elena who gave me the first seed of hope. She took me to a storage room in the back of the center, a dusty, forgotten room. In a corner, covered by a sheet, were 3 old sewing machines, donated and never used. "Maybe you can fix them," she suggested, with a simplicity that belied the power of her words. "You could teach other people. Many women here would like to learn a trade, to have a way to earn their own money." The idea was so small, so fragile, but it lit a tiny light in the darkness of my despair. Fear, however, was a powerful enemy. I was 72 years old. My hands no longer had the firmness of before, and my energy was limited. Who would want to learn from an old woman who had been discarded by her own son? The nights were the worst, haunted by nightmares of the icy pool water and the sound of Daniel's laughter. Doubt gnawed at me. It would be easier to give up, to accept his help, and live the rest of my days in a golden cage, sedated by false security. Freedom was a steep and frightening path. Elena became my safe harbor. I told her about Daniel, not just about his cruelty, but also about the love I once felt for him, which made the betrayal even more painful. She listened to me and shared her own battles, her own losses. Our friendship was built on the solid foundation of shared vulnerability, mutual respect, and understanding. She and the others at the center were becoming the family I had lost, a family not of blood, but of choice, united by kindness and care. One day, standing in front of the dusty sewing machines, I made a decision. I looked at my hands, the same hands that had rocked my son, that had sewn his first clothes, that had worked tirelessly to give him a future. These hands had been rejected, but they were not useless. They could still create, fix, build. In a voice that trembled but was full of a new determination, I told Elena I would try. I would fix the machines. I would teach what I knew. I would sew a new future for myself, stitch by stitch, from the scraps of a broken life. Months passed, and the dust of my old life began to settle, giving way to a new foundation. The dusty storage room transformed into our small sewing cooperative. The constant, comforting sound of the machines was the soundtrack to my new existence, a melody of work and companionship. The women I taught, each with her own stories of struggle and overcoming, became my family. I was no longer just Maria, the abandoned mother, but Donna Maria, the teacher, the friend. There was a respect in their eyes that healed old wounds, and the purpose I found there filled the void Daniel had left. With the money we earned selling our pieces at a local fair, I was able to rent a small room in a boarding house a few blocks from the community center. It was a tiny space with just a bed, a chair, and a small window that looked out onto a flowery courtyard. But for me, that room was a palace. It was mine. The feeling of closing the door at night, knowing that space was the fruit of my own effort, was a form of wealth I had never known. Independence had a sweet taste, and the peace I felt when I laid my head on the pillow was the greatest luxury of all. The news about Daniel came like distant thunder on a clear day. Elena showed me on her cell phone, a fraud scandal of gigantic proportions. His name was in all the headlines. His company, his pride, was under investigation, his assets were frozen, and his reputation, which he valued above all else, was in ruins. The image of the perfect son and successful businessman had shattered, revealing the greed and dishonesty that hid beneath the polished surface. The house of cards he had built with such arrogance was collapsing. Reading those words, I felt no joy, not a shred of satisfaction at his fall. There was no pleasure in revenge. What I felt was a deep, hollow sadness, an old pain that throbbed in my chest. I cried not for the corrupt businessman, but for the boy, who got lost along the way, for the soul he sold in exchange for unbridled ambition. I saw the tragedy of a life spent accumulating the wrong things, of a man who gained the world, but, in the process, had completely lost himself. He was poorer and more alone than I would ever be. I tried to push the news out of my mind, focusing on my work, my students, the routine that kept me sane. Life at the community center continued, with its small challenges and great joys. But in the bottom of my heart, I knew he would come looking for me. It was an old pattern. Since childhood, Daniel only remembered me when the world turned its back on him, when he needed a refuge, a solution that only a mother's unconditional love could offer. I prepared for his arrival, not with fear, but with the calm of someone who knows a storm is approaching. And he came. On a sunny afternoon, a shiny black car, which looked like a spaceship on our modest street, pulled up in front of the community center. Daniel got out. The usual arrogance in his posture was gone, replaced by a visible weariness. The expensive suit was wrinkled, and there was a shadow of desperation in his eyes that not even his sunglasses could hide. He looked at our simple building with ill-disguised contempt, the exiled king visiting the peasants' territory. When he entered our workshop, the sound of sewing machines and cheerful chatter abruptly ceased. The silence was heavy, dense. All the women stopped what they were doing, their gazes fixing on this strange figure who brought with him the smell of a world of power and problems. He didn't look at any of them. His eyes found me from across the room, and he walked towards me with hesitant steps. "Mother," he said, and his voice, usually so firm and imposing, came out hoarse, almost a plea. He asked to speak in private. We went to the small room Elena used as an office. There, without beating around the bush, he laid out his desperate plan. His lawyer had advised him that the only way to generate some public sympathy and perhaps lighten his sentence was to build a narrative of redemption, and the centerpiece of this farce would be me. The image of a dedicated family man, caring for his elderly sick mother, would be his only salvation. The coldness with which he described the manipulation he intended was blood-chilling. Then came the offer. The final card of the man who believed everything in the world had a price. He promised me a luxury apartment in the best area of the city, private nurses, a driver, an allowance so large I would never have to worry about anything again. "Everything you've always wanted, Mother," he said, trying to force a smile that didn't reach his empty eyes. "I just need you to come back, to smile for the cameras by my side, to tell everyone that I am a good son." In that instant, as he spoke, I didn't see the desperate businessman before me. My mind took me back to the edge of that pool. I saw his face contorting in laughter. As I drowned, I felt the cold water and the desperation in my lungs. But something was different. This time, the memory didn't bring me panic. On the contrary, it brought me clarity. I had survived that drowning, not just of the body, but of the soul. The frail, frightened woman he pushed had died there, and in her place, another had been born. A deep calm settled over me. It was the quiet strength I had discovered in myself, nurtured by the solidarity of my new friends and the dignity of my work. The power he had always held over me had evaporated. I was no longer a reflection of his will, a shadow of his ambitions. I was Maria, a whole woman, and my answer would not come from fear or pain, but from the core of my newfound identity. I looked him directly in the eyes, without blinking. The stillness in the small room was absolute. "Daniel," I began, and my voice sounded firmer than I ever imagined possible. "You offer me a golden palace to live in, but my soul would live in a prison. You offer me all the comfort in the world, but you would steal from me the only valuable thing I have gained, my peace. The woman you humiliated," I continued, each word spoken slowly and deliberately. "The mother whose love you turned into shame, drowned in that pool many months ago. She no longer exists. You are looking at a stranger, someone you yourself created with your cruelty." I saw the shock on his face. He had expected tears, recriminations, perhaps a negotiation. He was not prepared for my serenity, for my total refusal to play his game. My final words were the sentence of our relationship. "The money you offer cannot buy back my dignity. And my peace, Daniel, the peace I have found in this simple place, with these real people, is worth more than all of your crumbling empire." I paused, letting the weight of those words settle between us. "I am not for sale. Not anymore." He was speechless, his face pale with disbelief and impotent rage. For the first time in his life, he was not in control. I stood up, and without a backward glance, I turned my back on him and his poisonous offer. I left the room and returned to my workshop, to the sound of my machines, to the heart of my new life. The whirring of the motors starting up again was the sound of my victory, the song of my definitive freedom. Returning to the workshop, the familiar sound of the sewing machines welcomed me like a lullaby. My friends looked at me, their faces a mixture of concern and curiosity. I just smiled, a small but firm smile, and they understood. No words were needed. They returned to their work, and our symphony of needles and fabrics resumed. The confrontation with Daniel hadn't shaken me as I had feared. On the contrary, that final refusal was the seal that had been missing from my letter of freedom. I felt lighter, as if I had finally shed an invisible weight I had carried my whole life. That day, I understood that our small project was much more than a hobby or a way to earn money. It was a refuge, a place where women who, like me, were considered invisible by society could find themselves again. Sewing was the tool, but our real work was rebuilding self-esteem, weaving bonds of friendship and solidarity. I decided that I would dedicate the rest of my days to strengthening that space so that no other woman would feel as lonely and disposable as I once did. Our story began to spread through the community. Elena's dedication to publicizing our work earned us a small grant from a local foundation that supported women's empowerment initiatives. With the money, we bought 2 more sewing machines and better quality materials. We named our cooperative Threads of Dignity. We began offering classes not only in cutting and sewing, but also in how to calculate prices and manage money. We were teaching more than a trade. We were teaching independence. Gradually, the workshop transformed into a home. We celebrated birthdays with simple cakes and sang "Happy Birthday" off-key. We cried together through sorrows and celebrated every small victory as if it were a world championship. The loneliness that once haunted me was replaced by a network of genuine affection and care. There, among scraps of fabric and spools of thread, I found my true family, one united not by blood, but by the choice to support each other, no matter what. The greatest payment I received was seeing the transformation on each woman's face. I saw Donna Lucia, a widow who lived locked in her house, become our best salesperson at the craft fair, chattering with customers. I saw young Anna, a shy single mother, gain the confidence to go back to school at night, dreaming of a better future for her son. Every piece we produced carried a piece of our story, our struggle, and our hope. We were sewing not just clothes, but also futures. My own transformation was visible for anyone to see. My stooped posture gave way to straight shoulders. The hands that once trembled now guided the fabric with firmness and precision. My eyes, once dull with resignation, now shone with the light of a purpose. I had discovered a wealth that is not accumulated in banks, but that multiplies with every life we touch. The joy I felt seeing my friends prosper was my fortune, a treasure no thief could ever steal. The irony of life was not lost on me. I lived modestly, with very little in material terms, but my heart was overflowing with meaning. In contrast, Daniel, who pursued material wealth above all else, ended up in the most absolute misery. I had peace, love, and a community. He had only the echo of his bad choices in a prison cell. Life, in its own way, gave us exactly what we valued most. I valued people. He valued money. The news of his conviction arrived, and I received it with serenity. He lost the company, the mansion was auctioned, his wife filed for divorce and bankrupted him. I did not pray for his downfall, but I also shed no tears for him. The pain of losing him had been processed long ago. What I felt now was a kind of final liberation, the cutting of the last thread that still tied me to that past of suffering and humiliation. I found in my heart the capacity to forgive him, not a forgiveness that absolved him of his actions, but a forgiveness that freed me from the weight of resentment. Forgiving Daniel meant, above all, forgiving myself for having allowed his cruelty to define my life for so long. By letting go of that last anchor of bitterness, I made space for joy to flourish fully in my heart, without shadows or reservations. The success of Threads of Dignity surpassed all our dreams. The owner of a charming boutique in a noble neighborhood of Miami discovered our work and was enchanted by the quality and the story behind each piece. She placed a large order for handmade bags, a contract that guaranteed our financial stability for the entire year. It was proof that work done with love and dignity always finds its value in the world. With my share of the profits, I was finally able to rent a small apartment just for myself. I painted the walls a pale yellow and filled the living room window with pots of geraniums. Every corner of that place was a reflection of my new identity, simple but full of color, life, and peace. It was my sanctuary, the definitive symbol of the independence I had won with my own hands. The future of our cooperative looked bright. The women who were my first students were now the teachers for the newcomers, perpetuating the cycle of help and empowerment. My dream was to expand and create a small shelter for women in vulnerable situations, offering not only a trade, but also a temporary roof and psychological support. The thread of hope Elena had given me was turning into a strong support network for the entire community. My life became the message I wanted to leave to the world, that it is never too late to start over. True family is the one that welcomes and respects us, and dignity is the only asset that, once reclaimed, no one can take from us. Happiness was not in a mansion with a sea view, but in a noisy room full of women laughing and working together for a better future. On the first anniversary of Threads of Dignity, we had a small party in the community center's courtyard. There was music, simple food, and a lot of laughter. I looked around at the happy faces of my new family, and my heart filled with immense gratitude. I had been pulled from the bottom of a pool to be thrown into a sea of loneliness, but somehow I had learned to swim, and finally, I had reached my safe shore. I was home. 3 years later, Threads of Dignity was no longer just a small cooperative, but a socially recognized brand in Miami. Our workshop occupied a larger space, and the sound of sewing machines mingled with the voices of dozens of women. We managed to create the shelter I had dreamed of, a safe place that had already helped so many to start over. I, now 75, didn't sew as much anymore, but acted as the matriarch of that place, offering advice, hugs, and the example of my own story. One afternoon, while having coffee in the courtyard, I saw a man standing across the street, watching our building. He was thinner, older, with the worn clothes of someone who had known hard times. It was Daniel, released from prison. He watched for a long time as women came and went, laughing, carrying their children. He saw me, surrounded by affection, and in his eyes, for the first time I saw no arrogance or anger, but a deep emptiness. He saw the true wealth he had destroyed and of which he could never again be a part. He turned and walked away, a lonely shadow on a street full of life. Have you ever done a kind gesture that changed a life? Leave a little heart if you believe that love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more stories of second chances. Comment. Love has no price if you also believe in human kindness.